Everybody had a good weekend, better than the Nationals last night. And this is a follow-up to a session that we had earlier this summer, which, as some of you may recall, included the pulling of the fire. So we ended up across the street on that one. So hopefully we don't have any excitement like we had then. So I want to begin by thanking Bob. There were a number of questions that our committee had as a follow-up to the previous work session, which I know he has worked diligently on securing responses to. And so we will be hearing an update with regards to as many of the answers as to those questions as we were able to secure. And then I believe there are some amendments that have been discussed that may be proposed this morning as well as we discuss this very important piece of legislation. So with that, let me turn it over to Bob to walk us through the packet.
Okay, good morning. We already discussed last time what the bill does. I'm not going to go over that again unless you'd like me to. The committee had some questions for more information last time. They're listed on page 3 of the packet, the staff memo. And we did get answers both from SEIU 32BJ, and we got some answers from IOBA. We didn't get any answers from what I believe is the Contractors Association, really. And we were unable to actually get any response from the District of Columbia about how it worked there, although we did get some information from 32BJ and IOBA and how it worked there. Oh, okay. Jim Stowe is here. He says he got something on Friday from from DC. Jim has been diligently trying to get anything out of the District of Columbia, and I guess I'm not really sure why they wouldn't answer us. I don't take any personal affront at that, but the questions essentially were how many office buildings would be affected by the bill and where are they located. There was some confusion about that. I got a pretty long list from finance and of about 94 buildings, 32 I think it was 32 buildings from 32 BJ or 34, something like that, in the low 30s from the union. We had them compare the lists, and it looks like finance was including just any kind of building that was over 350,000 square feet. And I think we're all in agreement. It looks like it's in the low 30s for the number of buildings that would be affected that are actually office buildings. Which brings me to a point that although finance included several, included some other types of buildings that maybe could be included in office building, but I don't think they're intended to. And one thing I would suggest, it's in the packet, is that we recommend an amendment that would make it clear that we're not trying to cover, where is that on the packet? Oh, on page 7 of the staff memo. Right now, it says an office building doesn't include a building owned by the United States, a state, or any local government. And I would suggest something used to put an or, a building used primarily for apartments, condominiums, retail stores, hospitals, schools, warehouses, parking garages, or data centers, which are the other buildings on the list that were not on 32 BJ's list, but are buildings that are over 350,000 square feet. That this wasn't really meant to cover schools, hospitals, warehouses. I mean, are they in the definition of an office building? Well, a hospital, not really, but could be. It's where professionals work. Schools are the same way. Retail stores, shopping centers, things like that. Certainly apartments, condominiums, which have certainly a much smaller area. Maybe the building may be 350,000 square feet, but the actual amount that the condo association cleans is much less. So that would be my first suggestion for an amendment to do that. Just to clarify so that we're sure we're talking about the smaller list and not the larger list.
So just a couple of questions, Bob. I think it's a reasonable recommendation, but was this some of the basis by which, did you find anything in the DC legislation that would be helpful with regards to the definition of office space versus not office space? Or was this just derived from your own due diligence and your own thoughts on the matter?
Yeah, it's from my own just concern that we were going to somehow do a bill that would end up potentially covering buildings we weren't trying to cover. And in looking at the two lists, it became clear that there are buildings over 350,000 square feet that have an office in them, but are not really office buildings per se. A hospital has an office in it. A school has an office in it. A warehouse may have an office in it. Even a parking garage may have an office in it.
The primary purpose is
The primary purpose is not as an office, so that's why.
I think this is a pretty exhaustive list. Was the list based on the large list that you had seen before and just an identification of the types of buildings?
Yeah, it's based on the list from finance and all of the buildings that were not on the 32 BJ list because they didn't feel they were office buildings that they pointed out. I think it's consistent with the intent of the bill. And I think it clarifies it. Hopefully I haven't missed anything. But when we say include, and even if it says does not include, even though it's a double negative, include in the code always means include but not limited to. So it doesn't exhaustively, if there is something we didn't think of that comes up after that's built after this that isn't directly into one of these categories. If it's not primarily an office building, then I think it wouldn't be covered.
Do my colleagues have any questions regarding this particular amendment?
I do. So, restate what the proposal is, what verbiage you're.
Okay, it's on page 7. It's double underlined towards the,
So number 2.
yeah, number 2. A building used primarily for apartments, condominiums, retail stores, hospitals, schools, warehouses, parking garages, or data centers.
So that is so.
Yes, that's the amendment to add that.
And just last clarifying question, all of those have their own technical definition, correct? Like a hospital, you have to have a state permit to be defined as a hospital.
Well, a hospital
It could be
does,
an
a
office
school
park
does.
With a medical facility.
Yeah, I mean, a
That's-
hospital
that's
wouldn't be,
technical.
yeah, a hospital wouldn't be like a building, right? There are some buildings on the 32BJ list that are medical offices on, what's that grouping, near Walter Johnson High School. There's a group of doctors' offices in these large buildings. That would still be in the bill. That's not a hospital.
Right, and so just to put a fine
Right.
point on it, a hospital is a definition defined by the state, and a grouping of healthcare providers is just that.
Just an office building with medical providers in it, right?
Okay.
Mr. Stowe, does the new information you have relative to what you learned on Friday related in any way to this particular amendment?
No, no, it is not.
Okay. So, would anybody like to entertain a motion to look at?
I'll move it.
Okay. Is there a second?
A second.
Okay. All those in favor of adopting this particular amendment to the bill, raise your hands. That's unanimous. And so we will move forward with the language as recommended on page 7 to further specify what is and is not.
Going back to the questions, how many office buildings are covered in DC law? I believe it was around 90. The current vacancy rates for large office buildings in DC and Montgomery County, got some conflicting information from 32BJ and AOBA. AOBA pointed out in certain areas of the county, there's a really significantly high rate of vacancy compared to certain areas in DC. 32BJ pointed out, I believe, that it was overall not that much different. I think their numbers, let me see where are their numbers. You can look at 32BJ's response is on circle 51. They've got 14.7% in Montgomery County, 13.5% in Washington, D.C. AOBA on circle 66 shows just some specific areas, that the Pike Corridor, Germantown, Rock Spring Park are significantly above the 14%. And DC has certain areas near the ballpark, Noma, Southwest, West End, which are significantly below the 13%. I guess what that means is, maybe the average comes out to 14 and 13, but there are areas in the county which have significant office vacancies. Is the way I would try and read them together. I'm certainly free to hear from 32BJ and AOBA on that.
Well, it does make sense in the sense generally that, office parks that are in more suburban place settings tend to have higher vacancy rates than those in more urban-based settings for obvious reasons.
Right.
The models have shifted. This is among the reasons Marriott, for example, decided to move less than 2 miles from their current headquarters to be in a more densely populated urban location.
Connected to mass transit.
Right.
Connected to mass transit. And
Right. I mean, the DC office market is probably not comparable to the Montgomery County office market in the sense that DC is the city. It's where all the metro stops are.
Right.
And, you know, and Montgomery County is not. You know, and certain areas of Montgomery County are similar. Bethesda is probably similar.
Right.
But a lot of areas are not.
So I understand just conceptually why there's such a large discrepancy between some of the numbers put forward by AOBA versus some of the numbers put forward by 32BJ because of the geography of those particular buildings and where they're located. But I don't know if my colleagues have any questions that they'd like to have answered regarding the discrepancy in data with folks in the audience that might be able to answer those questions. No? Okay.
All right. The next question is, what was the basis for DC permitting 20% part-time workers, and how did they decide on 20%? I think the 20% was a negotiation in front of the DC Council is what it sounds like. You know, that the employer is saying you need to give us something, you know, we have to have some part-time workers, and I guess an agreement was worked out at 20%. AOBA is asking for 30%. That, in their estimation, 20% isn't significant enough. The obvious problem is there are some people who really want to work part-time, and you know, and are not. That's their choice, and it's to be, and for flexibility reasons. Whether 20% makes sense or 30%, I really don't know. You know, I think there needs to be something. There needs to, you know, the bill as drafted has absolutely no leeway for, it's 0% part-time, except for weekend security guards. So, you know, I think at least 20. AOBA is saying 30. I mean, we're in a situation here where we've got, you know, the union that represents these employees making, you know, arguments that, you know, their employees need to be full-time to get health insurance, which certainly, you know, we would support them getting health insurance. And you've got the, you know, the Office Building Association, AOBA, telling us that it's going to increase the costs. The union says, no, it's not. I'm not sure we have any idea, you know, whether it's going to have a significant difference in the rents in the office parks in the county. You know, but I do think that some leeway is important to have, you know, to have some ability to have some part-time workers. I think 0 is too strict. And it's not what DC did. DC did 20. Again, the office vacancy rates are not quite the same in DC and in Montgomery County. So I think there's an argument to be made to go to 30, as IOBA asks. But some percentage, I think, ought to be there.
So I appreciate that analysis. I think my feeling on this is that there are some employees in any industry who are seeking part-time work for a variety of reasons, whether they be students, as we heard from the gentleman who testified in opposition and as a concern to the bill. What the right percentage is, I'm not quite sure. I do think that there is a discernible difference between Montgomery County and the District of Columbia, so I don't think that's an apples to apples comparison, and so 20% here isn't the same, in my opinion, as 20% here in Montgomery County, so I'm more inclined to support 30%. The other concern I have, and I know I've shared this with my colleagues and both advocates in favor and against this bill, is there will be some people that lose jobs, and current part-time employees who will, just by the issue of math, will not be able to participate in, and 32BJ is acknowledged, even in the District of Columbia, there was some loss of positions, acknowledging that those folks were placed on a priority list and then were placed in other jobs because of the high turnover rate within the industry. But it is a practical reality that some people will be losing positions here. So I don't know that there is a way for us to be able to quantify the difference between 20 and 30% as it relates to how many people would be able to sustain those jobs that do want something part-time. But I'd be inclined to support the 30% personally, and we'll want to see how my colleagues feel about that.
So my question, Mr. Chair, do you want to, excuse me, entertain motions for amendments at this time, or do you want to get through the questions first and then go into motions for amendments? Just curious about the process.
I'd like to try and tackle these one at a time, just as we're having the conversation and have the proper context, because there are a variety of amendments that we're exploring, and so that we don't lose a thought, that we look at those amendments as they're occurring as it relates to those issues. But let me put the pause button there. Director Stowe, I think it would be appropriate for you to share with us anything that you learned from the District of Columbia on Friday as it relates to the entire conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of council. I finally was able to reach someone at the Department of Employment Services, and I want to thank our folks at SEIU here locally at 32B for their help and trying to make this all happen. But anyway, the point is this. Within the department, they worked very diligently trying to put together a program that they thought would work for everybody. So they took pains to do a couple of things. One was a massive public education effort when the bill was first passed. Because I asked the question, I said, what was the pushback? What was the issues that came up as part of this process? Much of it was avoided because they did do a lot of the public education pieces. They did webinars, they did roundtable discussions. First and foremost, they sent out notifications to everybody. So everybody was aware that this was the case, and then the follow-up was these other sort of ways of getting to them to kind of see whether or not they got the notification or not. And so I asked the question next about, well, how did employees hear about this as well? And so the idea was, it did work with the union there, of course. The mayor's office also was involved in this process. And lastly, just taking any meeting that was asked for to make real sure before implementation started that they in fact knew what the law said, both employees and those affected employers, and to ensure then that persons knew then how and what to do in the event that they found there were some issues or some concerns. Next question was, how then do you go about the business of seeing whether or not people are in compliance? And so what they have done is they put together a random audit that they do to all of those affected by this law, and those who are found in non-compliance. And by the way, while they're there at this particular site, they also get issues of the payroll. They get issues of trying to see whether or not sick and safe leave has been adhered to, as far as DC is concerned, and just ensuring that the issues relative to what they do in that particular department, employment services, were all up to snuff. And so as a result of that, they were to get a complete, comprehensive assessment of that employer or that site as a result of this random audit. Those who were found in non-compliance, as I mentioned, were immediately asked to come into compliance. Those who did not, then there was a fine process that follow up. That could be appealed then to the Attorney General there, and then final notice would be given then based upon the hearing of that case. Question I then asked was, how many complaints? Well, what they did was, because of this real effort to notify, this real effort to make sure people understood what compliance meant, and some idea that they would be in fact checked upon at some point in time, they have had, they believe, 100% compliance. Through working with the union there, they've been able also then to ensure then that when there were issues, that they were addressed immediately by that employer and to the satisfaction of those that were involved. So I think all in all, they have done an extraordinary job in moving this forward in ways that appears to be working for them. The only other thing I would add too is that they had staff to do this.
So it's just about to ask you.
So I asked the question. I said, well, how big is your staff, number one, in employment services? And so he said it'd be 26 people. I said, okay, great. Then I asked the question, well, specific on this project, what was involved? Well, they said to me that they had one lead person, which probably would be equivalent to our third-level investigator in my office, as an example, because they want the same kind of categories. And then they had two persons that would be lower level investigators in my particular nomenclature. And as a result of that, then 3 people actually performed this task for them in his office. They have their ongoing assignment of doing the, again, random audits. They are able then to keep up with their number of buildings that they do periodically, and believe because of that reason, and because employers know that they're going to come in and be checked once in a while, they believe that that's part of the deterrent for being non-compliant, but also motivation to be compliant as a result of all that. So, all in all, I asked lastly, and I needed to identify Michael Watts is the person I was speaking with there in D.C., that he felt that the program really was one for which it appeared persons were trying to work together to make it work for all persons involved. I was really encouraged to hear that. Now, whether that's the reality or not, I don't know that, but that's, again, from his assessment. And I think the big key to him saying this to me was this idea that the homework was done up front. Mm-hmm. The real education was done up front, so there was no sort of issues of concern or confusion around what is or what is not. And I think that played a big role.
Jim, that's really helpful. Was there a budget for that marketing or that PR? Or did they just do that in-house, or was there a campaign or firm that they retained?
They were able to hire persons. He did not give me the budget that he had at that point, but they were able to hire someone to help get that done as a result of that. It was a massive effort. In other words, with the mayor's office involved as well, it was really as I understood it, a concentrated effort between those who were involved to, again, make sure everybody knew what was going on. Mm-hmm. And I think that played an enormously important role in their compliance rate today.
Councilmember Rice has a question.
So, Mr. Chair, I'd actually like to ask if it was all right to bring up Mr. Tibbetts from the County Executive's office.
Yes.
So, Mr. Tibbetts, I just wanted to ask, now that you've heard from Director Stowe that we're looking at most likely 3 positions, maybe getting away with 2, because we don't have the same number of office buildings. So, I'm just not sure about the workload, but I know the workload that currently exists in the Office of Human Rights. I know that we've expanded our responsibilities to the Office of Human Rights over the past few years when the county executive was still on the council, and we know about how stretched that office is. Is there a commitment from the county executive not only to come up with a robust campaign to make sure that folks are informed, but also about providing the staffing so that they can follow up with this measure?
If this becomes law, of course, the executive is going to implement the law, and part of the law requires that we do the proper enforcement of the law. So to that extent, yes, there will be a commitment. If this becomes law, then that becomes the requirement to do it. Unfortunately, Mr. Stowe and I haven't had a chance to talk since this just happened. And what I didn't hear in the conversation, I'm sure it's in the packet, is the number of buildings in D.C. compared to the number of buildings that we have here.
I think it's about 1/3. We have about 1/3 of the buildings DC has. Yeah.
Okay. No, and I appreciate that answer, Mr. Tibbetts. I want to make sure that if we do something, that it actually works. And again, this benefit of having the information out there is beneficial not only for the employees, but also for the folks who own the office buildings as well, to create that level of cohesion and collaborative spirit. So I certainly want to make sure that that's there. That's my only question right now, so thank you.
But just to highlight a
Thank you,
point,
Mr. Chair.
based on budget deliberations last year, the Office of Human Rights is having a hard time with existing capacity, let alone adding another layer of responsibility. So we're not starting from an even playing field with DC with regard, it sounds like, with regards to oversight and capacity, although there are 1/3 the number of buildings. That's something we have to take into account too, and hopefully the executive branch will as well. Okay, thanks, Dale.
Thank you.
Okay, so my thought was that we would go through each of these because they're related but unrelated to each other, and so that we don't get lost in translation that we focus on each of these amendments individually. And right now before us is the notion of adding 20 or 30% set aside for part-time contractors. I share my position on that, my views. Do my colleagues have any questions or thoughts or comments on that specific amendment? Councilmember Rice.
So I actually have an amendment that I've drafted. Would
Yes.
this be the appropriate time to do so? Thank you,
Yeah.
Mr. Chair. All right, so I have an amendment that actually my office has drafted. I think I've given it to you, Mr. Glass. I'll give it to you, Mr. Stowe, and Mr. Drummer was kind enough to draft this, so I know you recognize your own work, sir.
It's really well done.
It's very basic. Look, we know we're not DC. We wish we were in terms of the office market and vacancy rates and the success that the District of Columbia has had in terms of really what it's been able to accomplish in its continued economic development. And so from that perspective, and especially representing one of those areas that has one of the highest vacancy rates, there is concern when it comes to affecting the affordability of office space. For those who are continuously challenged in our area, I know that it creates a difficulty. And this is a tough one. This is tough, and I want folks to understand the reason why this is tough. This is tough because this isn't just about the employees that are working and servicing that building, but do understand there are employees who are also working in that building who will be affected by this as well. Not the people who clean it, but the people who go in each and every day to work there. Because as the rents rise, that means less opportunity for advancement for them. That means less opportunity for raises and for them. So it's all connected. And I want to make sure that folks understand that. This isn't just a cut and dry kind of cost comes from somewhere. But you also have to make sure that you're also trying to do the right thing by folks. And anyone who supported the Affordable Care Act, of which I did, and I know all of my colleagues did as well, and that premise about having access to quality health care is something that is also equally important and also costs us money. Because as people don't have access to health care, then they oftentimes will fall ill and go into hospitals instead of using doctor's offices. It all is connected. And so this isn't a very clear-cut kind of, oh, well, we have to do it this way, and there are benefits and drawbacks on all sides. I'm trying to strike a compromise. I'm trying to strike something that gives us balance, that allows for us. And so in my talks with Councilmember Glass, and I really appreciate his input on this as well, we've come up with the amendment that basically adds to the minimum work week that's already in the bill that says a covered employer may preserve up to 30% of the total hours scheduled for all building maintenance workers at a covered location for part-time workers with a minimum shift of 4 hours per day and 20 hours per week per covered building maintenance worker. So in essence, this is similar to what DC has done, but increased it 10% to 30%. I'd like to move the amendment with just saying again that I also heard from employees who do want to work part-time. I had this conversation with SEIU 32BJ, and I really appreciate your partnership and your willingness to have these conversations with me. I am concerned about folks who do have two jobs and who want to work two jobs, whose spouse may have health insurance and may not want that. And I do understand that in DC, there was some displacement from people who actually still wanted to work part-time and weren't interested in working full-time for whatever personal reasons there are. I don't want to be in the business of making people lose their job. And so from that perspective, I think this strikes the balance.
Thank you. Councilmember Glass.
So I want to echo some of the sentiments that Mr. Rice said in preparing for today, recognizing that Washington, D.C. carves out 20% for part-time work. I think given the numbers that we're talking about, the vacancy 30% is fair. And just my own personal take on this, I grew up in a household with a single mom who worked two jobs. She worked a full-time job as a bookkeeper and a part-time job as an administrator for a trade school. And she needed that part-time job. She had to, otherwise my life would not be what it is today. And one of the greatest struggles my family went through was when my mother lost her full-time job. She had to give up her second job in order to get unemployment benefits. But I share that because a second part-time job is sometimes a necessity in families. And I want to make sure that individuals have that option. And I think this is a fair compromise to do what we think is the right thing to do. So I second this amendment.
Okay, all those in favor of the amendment as stated by Councilmember Rice, raise your hand. And that is unanimous. So that is the second amendment that we have asserted to this particular bill.
Okay, going back to the questions. The next one was, how did contractors in DC implement the 20% rule for part-time workers? We got information from 32BJ on that, and to summarize it, their union worked with the employers to implement the law. I guess Jim told you about what DC did to publicize the law so that people knew about it, and they created a list of for people that got laid off, a priority list, and the employers agreed to hire people from that priority list as they had openings. That's basically the information we got about how it was implemented, along with what Jim told you about DC, which I guess leads to, at the very least, you need to have, if the bill gets enacted, a significant lead time before it takes effect to put into place the educational component and allow employers to adjust. Right now, it's effective on July 1, 2020. But of course, this bill was first introduced, with that date, but it was introduced in May of 2019, so it assumed a one-year period, pretty much, which would not happen if it's enacted, this fall. So you may want to consider changing the effective date.
Jim, did they discuss the length of time of their particular campaign to alert the public about the bill?
No. I think that the idea was they felt that they had a comprehensive list, since it was a finite list of folks they were talking about, at least in terms of the buildings involved here. And the number I had was a little less than 100. But the point is that, and first of all, establishing what the universe looked like, who was in it, how many buildings, and so forth and so on. They really very much targeted those particular buildings for their educational efforts. So it really was more focused than just sort of, spread out throughout a given period of time. So I think that was helpful to be able to have it that succinct. And so the message could also be shaped. It could also be, formalized for those particular employers and work sites. And then by working so closely with the union, they were able to make sure then that whatever was done for workers, that there was clear and concise language that was also good for the understanding of those who might be affected by it.
I also think another benefit to making sure the public at large is aware of these issues is, as issues may arise that are unique to Montgomery County, it would give us some time to adjust as necessary.
Yes,
if
yes.
there are elements of the bill that we haven't considered, given the unique nature of the implementation of this here in the county. So I think that's another side benefit to giving us a reasonable amount of lead time to make adjustments as necessary. So I agree with Bob that a July 1st implementation feels very rushed, especially given the challenges with regards to the staffing complement within the Office of Human Rights. I don't know what the right answer is in terms of what is the right implementation. I think on the longer end, in my mind, is a year from July 21st. Potentially on the shorter end is January 1st. But I don't know if my colleagues feel one way or the other on what the appropriate implementation would be. And Jim, if you have a recommendation, whether a year from implementation of this bill is enough time for the kind of education that needs to happen. Also acknowledging that if there are fiscal impacts for this, they wouldn't take into effect until July 1st, 2020 anyways. If money's added to your budget to help with this. So any thoughts on that, Jim, in terms of?
Well, we certainly want to make sure we had a discussion, obviously, with the administration in terms of sort of seeing where this lies in the process. I think the admonishment that I think I heard in a way in terms of making sure we have whatever it takes to make sure we do it correctly, I think is something we certainly take under consideration, and I'm sure the county executive would be very supportive of that to the extent we can and meet certain budgetary constraints. But I believe that when you do and take due diligence, I think in terms of doing it correctly, I think we have less issues on the implementation side. So I would, if I were to be in a position then to say anything about this, I would certainly then err on the side of making sure we have enough time to make sure we do it right.
I will say that it's not comparable necessarily, but the sick and safe leave law was 18 months leeway before it went into effect.
Yeah.
Because that involved all the employers in the county, so it was a bigger job than this. This is just one distinct industry, but we have done that in the past, given a long lead time when we change the minimum benefits for private sector employers, employees.
Just procedurally, Bob, would this require a motion to
Yeah.
implement a specific date of implementation?
Yeah, you need to put an actual date in there, not just, so, I would recommend either January 1, like you said, of 2021, which would give you a little more than a year, assuming this gets enacted this fall, or you could go to July 2021, one of the other.
Do my colleagues have thoughts on that? Councilmember Rice.
So, yeah, the reason why I asked Mr. Tibbetts is because I wanted to find out if this is going to be in the county executive's budget, both in terms of positions as well as in terms of marketing budget. We'll know that in March, but even if it's not, depending on whether or not we're able to put it in and insert it if it's not included, still requires at least at minimum until June, July anyway, from that perspective. And so that, of course, obviously then puts that out. And it's not saying that the county executive's not. You just found out about it. So I completely understand, Dale, where you are. But that being said, and the constraints that we know are on the county executive's budget, from a comfortability perspective, in terms of us being able to, then we're on recess, coming back to override, or not override, but to come up with a supplemental, getting that passed. You're already looking at October, November timeframe at the earliest from a functional perspective in terms of posting, having it listed. I'm just talking about the real aspects of what the county would have to do in terms of making sure that you have the positions if they're not included in the county executive's budget. So that already puts us at October, November. So at that point, I mean, another month or two, just picking a number or a month, you're looking at anywhere between November at the earliest to January. It seems cleaner to have a beginning of the year start date. I mean, either a middle or beginning, right? That's typically what we try and do. We don't just haphazardly just pick random dates. So I would lean towards that, but I mean, so I'm agnostic.
Yeah. So I have a little bit of experience with the executive branch, knowing sort of how a challenge bureaucracy can be. And acknowledging the unique nature of this bill and wanting to make sure that we are on the side of doing it right and not rushed.
Yes.
I think 6 months is negligible. The important thing is that, once it's implemented, it's done well. So I am personally comfortable with the July 1st, 2021 implementation date to give us enough lead time to get it going. But want to see how Councilmember Glass feels about it.
Right, so Mr. Rice is starting either at the beginning of the calendar year or the beginning of the fiscal year are the optimal times. That's when we prefer. So they're not arbitrary dates. They're functional dates. If we look into the crystal ball, we're already in October. We're having this work session. It is my assumption that we will finalize this work session and put something before the full council later today. When that comes to the full council and then get signed, we're essentially looking at the end of this year. And so if we want a one-year implementation, that brings us to January of 2021.
Yeah, that's true.
I understand I understand the budgetary conversation, the component that you're talking about, but I want to circle back to the conversation, Mr. Tibbetts, and the executive branch and the staffing. I'm going to put forward another proposal. Rather than have this managed by the Office of Human Rights, stretched. And this date conversation is relevant because we're not sure what the staffing is. I think it might be worthwhile to see if it's handled by Mr. Sluchansky and his labor relations, in his chief labor relations component. Given that it's ultimately workforce labor relations, and it's the first time the county is presumably implementing a piece of legislation affecting labor relations, that he be the best person to help monitor and move this forward. It's something to consider. I'm not sure what his current portfolio is. I hear he might have room to take on some more additional tasks, but to relieve the burden, I think this is a third option that might also help not delay it as much as that we're talking about. So,
Just procedurally, Bob, in terms of the implementation of how this policy will be enacted and that's ultimately, obviously, the executive branch's authority. So how they carry this out, what role does council play in prescribing who and who isn't involved in the management of this?
Well, the bill would require significant amendments to do that. The bill has got the enforcement in the Office of Human Rights. One reason it's in the Office of Human Rights is, and the reason we've been putting these things in the Office of Human Rights without regard to their staffing, because their staffing is probably not sufficient, I agree, but is that you need to have a system that can provide an administrative hearing on the record, and the Office of Human Rights has that built in. They do hearings and make findings that are appealable on the record. The Office of Labor Relations doesn't do that. The Office of Labor Relations, well, right, I'll tell you the truth, right now there's a chief labor officer the executive sent over. Why would I tell you anything other than the truth? The executive, I stopped saying that. The executive sent over a bill just recently, it hasn't been introduced yet, to create an Office of Labor Relations in the county executive's office, which essentially would move some of the people in human resources into the Office of Labor Relations and under the Chief Labor Relations Officer. But their entire portfolio is dealing with the county unions and county employees. It's really an offshoot of the Office of Human Resources. It's not, and they're not set up to hold hearings. You'd have to set up a whole new administrative hearing process. At a certain point in time, the District of Columbia, Baltimore City, some other local jurisdictions have actually set up a Department of Labor, like the state of Maryland, that deals with just across the board. Once you reach the point where you've created enough labor laws for, private sector employers beyond just the county employees, you may need to think about creating a separate Department of Labor, but it doesn't have to be a separate Department of Labor. You could just beef up the Office of Human Rights. They're already here. And they could set up a division inside the office that would be doing this, the sick leave law, the minimum wage law, the ban the box law, all these things that we've enacted without really expanding their office, beyond what they're originally set up for was the discrimination laws, anti-discrimination laws. But they have the mechanism, they just don't have the people. So I'm not really sure the Office of Labor Relations would be in a position to do it without. But you would need to amend the bill, because right now the bill is set up for hearings in front of the Office of the Human Rights Commission if there are complaints and you file a complaint with the Office of Human Rights, they investigate it, which is the kind of thing they already do. They just don't have enough people to do it. But they do it.
If I may, one other point I would just share with you that I'm not asking for something for which we don't have wherewithal to actually have impact, but the one thing I think that does happen as a result of things coming to the Office of Human Rights is the fact that it is perceived to be an independent body, particularly when those issues that are appealed are actually done by citizens and residents of this community as opposed to those of us who may work for the government. And I think as a result of that, it gives you that sense that a fair hearing was held, an opportunity for both sides to be heard without any prejudice, and the end result does represent then a finding of fact as opposed to anything else. So I think, Councilwoman, is one thing I think makes it a little bit different than other kinds of things that normally employee relations normally gets involved with, that I would just share as a point of fact more than anything else.
Well, if I could, this is uncharted territory for the county in terms of our workplace regulations. And so given that, given the ground that we're walking on, I think it's fair to think outside the box. It's fair to figure out how our bureaucratic system can best work to accommodate the need. And that's why I'm thinking outside the box. It might not work in this particular case, but clearly there are many more conversations that need to be had. I'm still waiting for the executive to introduce some streamlining, other ways of making our county government more efficient. I'm offering some suggestions here in this particular bill. I look forward to having more conversations about that. But Mr. Drummer, a comment about the hearings and about the hearing process. If I recall what you had said about DC, 100% compliance, correct? So presumably there aren't any administrative or many administrative hurdles in terms of hearings and the need for it.
That's what we hear from DC. I mean, but you still have to have it. They have a hearing process. The one problem we have that DC doesn't have, DC being both the city and the state, essentially, can create a cause of action where you can just go to court if you're unhappy with, if you violate DC law. We don't have that ability to do that under Maryland law. We can only set up an administrative hearing that's appealable to the court. We can't create a cause of action because that's not considered a public local law. We've run into that problem before. And so under the Maryland system, we're forced to do it this way. It would be easier to just say, if you violate this law, go to court. Court's already there. They're set up. Just go to court. But we don't have that ability to do that. So that's one reason that we needed to find. We ran into this problem when we first considered the minimum wage law. And again, with the sick and safe leave law, is that we needed to have some enforcement which would create an administrative hearing on the record. And rather than create a whole new system, we looked at human rights. They've already got that because they do it for discrimination cases. But we could create a separate system, and you could create a different Department of Labor to enforce these things. That all could be done. But you would have to amend this law to do it.
Understood.
For this.
Last thing I will just say that if we're looking so heavily upon DC and best practices from DC, and we're based on the research, this isn't a sticking point. I'm not sure we should dwell on it so much as being a potential sticking point here in Montgomery County.
So I really appreciate the suggestion, Councilmember Glass, and I do think it represents outside-the-box thinking. And I have also heard through the grapevine that there is some capacity within that newly created office for potential additional tasks. I would recommend that the executive branch look at the feasibility of incorporating Mr. Slichensky and his office into the work of the Office of Human Rights, but I think from a foundational standpoint, the Office of Human Rights, as we're currently constructed without massive changes, is in the best position to carry forward and process these laws. But I think there is an opportunity there for collaboration. And until such time that more capacity is added, that Mr. Slachinski or other folks within county government might be able to provide some support.
Yeah, I guess I should just backtrack just a little bit. There's nothing to stop the executive from asking the Office of Labor Relations to help with the education campaign and to, do that stuff. The actual investigations and the complaints would still have to go to the Office of Human Rights, but they could draw from anywhere in the county government to help with the educational campaign. That would not require a change in law. They could do that on, just.
To your point, I personally don't feel comfortable pushing forward a change or amendment in terms of the location of this right now. I don't know how you feel about that, Councilmember Rice, and Councilmember Glass, if you had any follow-up to that suggestion based on what you've heard and the feedback.
Sure. So right now, trying to rework the machinery within Montgomery County to effectively enforce this. We're not ready for that right now,
Right.
but it's important that we had this conversation and that the executive recognizing that we still need to move forward, find efficiencies so that legislation and regulations like this are enforced and everything works well.
And I do think that, and we're going to get back to the initial conversation as far as this part of the conversation regarding the date of implementation, but within a reasonable amount of time, I think we should revisit this bill and its enactment and the capacity within the Office of Human Rights. That can be done within the context of the budget process, but I do think, given the unique nature of this bill, that we will likely need a standalone work session to explore how it's being implemented and review where we are. But going back to the initial discussion, and I appreciate your comments, Mr. Drummer, and I do think, based on my colleagues' conversations with other colleagues through my office, there is interest from our colleagues on full council, assuming this does move forward from committee, and enacting this as soon as possible and possibly the fall, which would mean, if it were, that would give an additional 2 months in addition to the year for us to explore implementation. So then you're looking at a 14-month lead time before implementation for January 2021. So that, to me, feels reasonable based on what was originally proposed. So I'm comfortable with the January 21 implementation, but want to see what my colleagues say.
Mr. Tibbetts, I hate to put you on the spot again, but being that a lot of this is budgetary, does the county executive, do you think, I know you haven't had a chance to talk to him, this is all on the fly, but do you think that there may be any opinion from the county executive in terms of what date he may prefer in terms of implementation date, whether it be January or July of 2021? I think those are the two dates we're looking at right now. And I apologize again. I know this is.
I obviously, I haven't had a chance to talk to him yet, but it seems like a year out. The January, we will have the FY21 budget. It will be out, and so I think that would 6 months into that would be an appropriate time. Putting it out 18 months for the level of number of buildings that we have involved here, it seems like an excessively long time to me, but
Okay. No, that's fine.
I'm not committing the executive on that, but that's where I think we would be at.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Tibbetts. So I'd be fine with the January 2021.
Okay.
I'll go ahead and move that.
Second, all those in favor? Unanimous. January 21.
I would add that if the bill is enacted and it doesn't take effect till January 2021, it doesn't mean that the parties couldn't negotiate earlier to do it.
Sure.
I mean, they certainly are free to do that, knowing what's on its way. That might make it easier for them to push it up sooner. If they think they can do it sooner, it just wouldn't require us to actually enforce it until the law took effect. All right. The next question was the breakdown in number of covered workers in each job title and what percentage of each job title are currently part-time. If you look on, we got answers to that from 32BJ. On Circle 52, it looks like they're mostly talking about cleaners and security officers. Of the cleaning market, 79% of the cleaners are currently part-time. Only 21% of them are given full-time hours. It's pretty much the opposite for security officers. It's 78% full-time and 22% part-time. And in fact, the bill already includes an exception for security officers that just work weekends when the office buildings are usually closed, which leads to I think, possibly some discussion about should we limit the types of workers that we're talking that are defined as a building maintenance worker. Why are we including security officers, for instance, when 78% of them are already full-time? I guess you can look at it two ways. One is it's not going to be a problem. And two is, that's one way of looking at it. The other way is, why are we trying to fix something that's not a problem? With cleaning, the cleaning workers, it clearly is a problem. 79% of them are part-time. So that seems to be where you would want to concentrate it. I don't know the definition includes other types of employees. I don't think there are that many of them in office buildings. It's the way the bill was, a janitor, a building cleaner, I think is probably the same thing. Security officer, concierge, I don't know that many concierges in office buildings. Door person, I haven't seen a door person in an office building in many, many years. Handy person, well, you don't really see them. A building superintendent, we're talking really about cleaning people.
Right.
And maybe we should think about just limiting it to that. But, so that's the next thing that issue I think the committee ought to discuss.
Councilmember Rice has some thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I have an amendment that basically defines exactly what you just said, Mr. Drummer. I've had a chance to talk, and I really want to thank SEIU 32BJ for your discussions, especially understanding that when it comes to a lot of our security personnel, which may be off-duty police officers who are already well covered under, but also a young man who actually came in my office who is in school at Montgomery College, but who also works as a concierge, and was very concerned about the fact that him working this part-time job to help pay for his schooling would have meant that he would be out of this job that he loves, and he's actually able to. And it's just very interesting as you talk to folks, and I think that we always need to do this as we're looking at these bills with good intentions, is that he's like, this is the perfect job for me because I get to sit at the desk and I get to study. And then when somebody comes up, I put down my book and I'm able to talk to them and do what needs to be done. And then I go back to studying again. It's the perfect job for a student. And so from that perspective, it really is one where I just really appreciate you working with us and understanding that these are things that we may need to take out. So I have an amendment that basically just says building maintenance worker means an individual employed at a covered location performing janitorial services, and then go with the rest. So it strikes that as a janitor, building cleaner, security officer, concierge, door person, handy person, or building superintendent, and just says that anyone covered is anybody who's performing janitorial services to make sure that we're getting at who the building maintenance worker truly is. And so from that perspective, I'd like to move that amendment. It's been given to all parties here at the dais.
A second.
Seconded by Councilmember.
And I want to thank Councilmember Glass, too, for also working with me on this amendment as well.
Great. All those in favor say aye. That amendment passes unanimously as well.
All right. The next question is the availability of public transportation at the various covered office buildings in the county. We got some answers from 32BJ on that. I'm sure we got answers from Ioba on that. Well, I think we did. On page 52, circle 52, and I apologize for this. They sent me a map of impacted buildings, and I apparently forgot to put it in the packet. But basically, what they're saying is that the union is saying that the majority of cleaners drive or carpool with other co-workers or take a public bus. Far fewer take Metro Rail. It's Metro Rail is what closes at 11, or 12 during the week, which I still don't understand. And they don't believe it's going to cause a problem. I guess the committee was concerned with if you have full-time hours, if you start working at 5 instead of getting out at 9 or something like that, you're going to be working till middle of the night, and then you'll have trouble taking Metro Rail home because Metro Rail isn't going to be operating. And I know we can't fix that, but wish we could. But anyway, that they don't see it as a problem. 32BJ gave us lists of Metro Rail, when they're open and when they're closed, and we all know that they're closed way too early. So, if you're going to do it, do it. I don't know that the fact that the workers, I assume the union represents the workers, they'll figure out how to get there. It's they'll carpool or take buses. The county ride-on buses go pretty extensively throughout the county. I mean, I'm a rider. I like the ride-on buses. I go because it's free for me, but as a county employee, it's there are buses that go to many areas of the county, certainly where most of the office buildings are located, most of them, maybe not all of them. And in that case, they're not going to be served by Metro Rail anyway. Any office building that's near a Metro Rail stop is also on a ride-on bus stop. So I'm not really sure that that's something you ought to change the bill for. I'm not sure how you could change it. Either you do it or you don't do it.
I appreciate the due diligence. I think that's very helpful, and that level of analysis appeases some of my concerns and some of the concerns that have been raised to me regarding the transportation issues. Councilmember Glass.
So we know that access to transportation is the greatest indicator of an individual's economic status and upward mobility. And making sure that all of whatever time of day they work have access to their job sites is fundamentally important. And at this point, I'll share that I have asked our Office of Legislative Oversight review of our ride-on bus service to take a deep dive to see who our ridership is, where they're coming from, who they are, which is relevant to this conversation, so that in a year time, a little less than a year, we'll have a good sense who's riding our ride-on bus system and can revisit this conversation or unable to get to their work sites. Again, whatever their vocation might be, we need to make sure that people are able to access around our community. So just letting you all know publicly that this information will be coming out in the next year, and we can incorporate it into many different conversations.
Great. Thank you, Councilmember Glass. What's next, Rob?
All right, the next is number 8, how many security guards working in county office buildings? We've already taken care of that. Why would using an all full-time staff cost the employer more? Well, it appears to be 2 reasons. One is if they're going to have to pay health insurance for employers, that's going to cost them money. But of course, that's the purpose of the bill, so we're not too worried about that. The other reason that it might cost more is that if you have less people working more hours, you're going to have to keep the utilities running in the building longer, and the utility bills will go up. I guess we had testimony from AOBA that it could be 10 to 15% more. I think that includes the health insurance as well as the utilities. We had testimony as well from people in support of the bill, advocates, saying it wouldn't significantly increase the office, cost of maintaining large office buildings. You know, I'm not sure what it's going to have some increase in cost, I'm sure. If it didn't, people would do it already. I mean, the office, the office buildings would have already done it if it was cheaper, if it was going to save them money. And clearly they don't believe it is. But again, the bill has got other purposes. So.
Councilmember Rice.
Well, thank you. And Bob, I just wanted to bring about another point that, again, as a spouse of a person who owns a business in an office building, it is one in which, what we also have to consider is about the fact of people being sick and showing up for work versus not. And that also takes longer time. So as you have a person that's doing shift work and one of those employees doesn't show up because they call out sick, and then all the other employees have to do it, it takes the same amount of time as it would if it were, because it's going to take longer to do that same amount of work. So, and those are the kinds of things that, like I said, understanding both sides of this issue, understanding that, yes, in fact, there is some cost associated with this. There is some cost savings or some back end that comes out of it also. We don't know what that magic number is. We know that it's going to cost more, just like we know the Affordable Care Act costs more. But we also know that it's better for people, right? And ultimately, at the end of the day, is it better, and do we have a more healthier cohort of community members? And I think that kind of is the tipping point for us. And this is why you see this split and divide on this, because it's so hard. But we want to try and balance. So I just want to acknowledge that, because you're right. There is some longer work, but also as a person who sees how the impact of having a person who calls out sick plays on a business, it is also one in which it does back out some of that as well.
So I did receive some analysis from AOBA, but also some of the property owners who were going to be directly impacted by this, with costs as high as an additional 22 cents per square foot to as low as 4 cents per square foot. And cumulatively over time, that does add up. And the argument that was made was, we're competing with DC and now Prince George's County on a number of different levels for businesses that are relocating to our area. So any additional amount, however small, puts our properties at a competitive disadvantage relative to other properties around the area, and that disproportionately impacts more suburban-based office buildings. But I think the broader point, however, is, and this is always a balance that we try to strike within the county, is acknowledging the importance and the impact of economic development while also keeping to our moral compass as a community and trying to do right by those most vulnerable among us. And as we heard from very passionate testimony from the beginning of this process until now, our janitorial and custodial workers are paramount to the success of our communities as a whole, and disproportionately struggle. And I so appreciate your comments, Councilmember Glass, because I've heard you make those comments before, and I know, having worked in the nonprofit sector with the youth of a lot of the families who have these jobs, having health insurance will, I think, be obviously an extraordinarily net positive, and the minimal amount of money added to the additional square footage, in my opinion, supersedes. However, I will say, economic development, and this is not the Fed committee, but clearly is something that we as a council and the executive branch have to be able to focus on. And the feedback I've gotten from a number of folks in the business sector is it feels like a death by 1,000 cuts. And this is another one. What I would say to those folks is, we hear you. And we have to do what we can to address the more significant issues such as transportation and access, and more proactively reaching out to economic development opportunities within the community. Conversations that I think will help mitigate the impact of this potential bill, and hopefully, if we can get our buildings to a more reasonable rate of occupancy and vacancy, they'll hire more people. And so that will raise all boats. So I know I'm kind of getting on my soapbox here. I was going to save this for the end, but it's relative to the conversation of what the true cost of this particular bill is going to be, because it's difficult to measure this just in terms of dollars and cents. And so I just wanted to make those comments as I've processed and tried to figure out where I am on this particular bill and where I will land. So what else you got, Bob?
All right. Well, the last one was about office vacancy rates. I will just point out that AOBA, in their answers, asked for an additional amendment dealing with buildings that are less than 50% occupied. And I see Mr. Rice has one as well. So maybe I'll let him describe it.
Well, thank you, and I want to thank AOBA, working with them. You know, we talk with both sides. It's incredibly important to make sure that we're trying to strike a balance. And so really here, and this is actually kind of personal, because I do see buildings in my district, and by the way, my wife doesn't have a building, her office building that she works in is not in my district, but this is one in which, for me, is a tremendous concern, because we see in some of our outlying areas to where there is a challenge when it comes to these office buildings and their vacancy rates, and really is one that can impact small businesses. Keep in mind that when we think about an office building, we think that it's the office building itself and not the businesses that are within. And oftentimes these are folks who are trying to start up a company, you know, and they're starting from the ground up and putting forth their house, you know, as credit for, you know, trying to invest in this new idea and trying to make things happen. And they're employing people who are also, they don't have a lot of money to be able to pay them, and they're all in it together with the hope that they're going to be able to build the next, you know, wedding wire or whatever the case may be. These are the things that really happen here in Montgomery County. And we don't want to stifle that innovation. We don't want to stifle that economic development. And so if we see buildings that are already struggling, we don't want to be that last death blow for those buildings. And so I think there needs to be an exemption for those buildings that are on the verge, that are really struggling. You know, there are buildings that are successful and have lots of folks that are in it. And certainly from that perspective, while I understand it's still going to be an increase depending on what that number is, and based on our amendments today, that number will change, I'm sure. But there'll still be an impact, and we understand that, and we need to work through that. But there are some to where I just don't think it's practical for us to expect these tenants to bear the burden of this. You know, let's make no assumption that the property owner is just going to take that in. They pass it along just like all other businesses do. And so from that perspective, I really think that we need to be cognizant of that. And so this amendment just basically says that we're exempting any of the buildings that have an occupancy rate of 50% or less, so that they don't have to be subject to this. And then, of course, if the business becomes more successful, then, and you know, they get more occupancy, it works out for all of us. It's a benefit for all. And so that's the amendment, and I move it. And I want to thank Councilmember Glass again for working with me on this one as well.
Thank you. And I would like to second the amendment and just saying another way. Well, first, just to clarify that it's 50% or more have an occupancy
That it's applied to.
Right. But as Montgomery County continues its transition from suburban office parks to more transit-oriented development, you know, some of our buildings are going through that transition, and we have to be mindful of that. And I think that this does just that.
Okay, just one quick comment. Fortunately, there aren't very many buildings with 50% vacancy rate. We want to keep it that way. And as was commented to me by a property owner who appreciated the gesture but felt that if there were 50% vacancy rate, they would so significantly decrease the amount of cleaning and janitorial services within a building that they felt this was sort of mitigated. But I think the principle is important, and so I support the amendment. And we've got a motion and a second. All those in favor of supporting the amendment say aye. Aye. It's unanimous.
All right, the other thing I wanted to add just is one of the benefits to the county was stated that right now, if you don't have health insurance and you have nothing, if you're a county resident, you at least have Montgomery Cares, which isn't a full substitute for health insurance, but gives you some medical benefits. And that to the extent we have less people with no health insurance, that would actually benefit the county. And so I asked the union, well, how many of your employees are county employees, are county residents? And of course, that can change over time. People are allowed to move in and out of the county all they want. But I'm told that it's about 77% of their members are county residents. So it is a significant portion that you're helping that actually do live in the county. I just wanted to make that point. That was information that I thought was important, and that's what I got as an answer. So with that, I think we've talked about the bill itself and what it does, and gone through all the questions that the committee asked last time. And I have nothing else to say that I didn't say last time and that isn't in the packet. There are some legal issues that I believe this bill is legal, and I think we can do it. And it is, as Councilmember Glass pointed out, it is a new step for us. I think it's pinpointing just one industry for a minimum work-related benefit that we don't, the only other time we've done it is sick and safe leave and minimum wage, but that was across the board. And, leads to the question of, well, is this the beginning or the end of this? Are we going to get more requests from this union, from other unions representing private sector employers? Is how about mandating this? How about mandating that? And I don't know. We might. So it might be opening up the door. But be that as it may, there is some reason for doing this. These are workers that do need help, and if they can get full-time hours, make a little more money, some will win, some will lose. Some people will lose their jobs. Some people will get more hours, make more money, get health insurance. So it's a balancing act. And
Boy, that's a great way to end. It's a balancing act. It certainly is on so many different levels, and I really want to appreciate Bob, you and you as well, Jim, for conducting exhaustive research on this issue, and I really want to thank my colleagues for the thoughtful amendments that they've put forward, and I want to thank everybody in the audience and those who are not here for their feedback on this. I think we've struck a reasonable balance, all things considered, and I will say that although we're looking at a January 1st implementation, I do think it'd be reasonable July of that same year for us to have a work session to review and evaluate and discuss the implementation of this and see how it is impacting businesses. And on a sidebar, we have to put our pedal to the metal on economic development, and that is something that we've discussed extensively. And so to our colleagues who are property owners that are out there, again, we've heard you, and this is something that we are as a county are fully committed to focusing on. And to my colleagues in SEIU 32BJ and friends out in the community, we so appreciate the efforts of your members to help sustain and also play a critical role in economic development for the county on a number of different levels. And so with that, can I get a motion to move this bill forward to full council, but before that, Councilmember Rice, did you have a comment?
I did. I just wanted to really pick up on what you said, because I think that, again, I want to remind folks that our objective is multifaceted. When we do things like this, you know, I hope that property owners understand this is not intended to somehow impinge on their ability to be successful, for us to make it harder for them to do business here in the county. It actually is the exact opposite. Our hope is that with healthier workers who feel as though they're a part, we'll do an even better job of taking, you know, ownership of their buildings and making them look great, which means they're attractive, which means people come in and use them and want to use the space, of having the time frame of them actually being on the job more means they're more productive, being that they have access to healthcare. We know that access to healthcare provides healthier employees. We know that. There's no question. There's nobody who denies that. So from that perspective, that is a huge plus, not only for just in that business environment that they're in, but in the greater community as a whole. People put themselves more at risk when they go to work sick because they're, you know, don't have the health insurance or don't have the flexibility. And so what that does is then put other employees at risk and create. These are all things to where we know, as a part of the Health and Human Services Committee, when we talk about the aspect of health and what we want to promote in terms of healthy people, let's not lose sight of that also, because there is a cost associated with that. We know with the rising cost of healthcare and everything that's out there that these are tremendous challenges that people, all of us, face, right? Regardless of whether you have a job and have great health insurance, I can promise you and tell you now, my mother who just went because she fractured 2 toes, incredibly expensive, even with health insurance. And so it really is one of those where, again, folks just have to understand and remember and realize what's going on, you know, and how we're trying to address this on multiple issues. And so from that perspective, I really want to thank AOBA for continuing to partner. I want to thank SEIU Local 32 BJ for continuing to partner to come up with a reasonable compromise, something that meets in the middle that I think accomplishes both objectives. Really getting us to the point where we're saying, look, you know, some of these just don't make sense. Some of these are things that we can tweak and make a little bit better for us, but also at the same time understanding the overall premise of this bill, which is to promote more healthy employees. That, at the end of the day, is how I see this bill. So I just want to thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Glass, for both of you's partnership in tweaking this bill.
Councilmember Glass.
I'll say thank you again to both of you throughout this process, working on some of the amendments, you know, getting all the information. Some of the information that we requested, I don't know what percentage, since we're heavy on percentages, information we didn't get, but that which we were able to receive has been helpful. And ultimately, this legislation is about improving health care for our residents and our workforce. And the county has been fiercely supportive of that, which is evident in the Montgomery Cares program and our continued support, expanding our opportunities. And it's good to know that 77% of this workforce lives in Montgomery County. And regardless of what would happen with this, they are able to get health care, and that is a wonderful thing. And you know, I'll insert some other politics too, that you know, my preferred presidential candidate for 2020 would want Medicare for all, which would make this entire conversation moot. And I wish we get to that point, you know, so that one day this legislation is not necessary because everyone in America will have health care. And I think that is a wonderful thing. We're short of that, which is why we have to have this conversation today. But last thing I'll say is that the amendments that we put forward were just a recognition that the Montgomery County office market is not the same as DC. And doubling down on Chairman Albernaz's comments and my colleague Mr. Rice's comments, we now have to really focus on economic development here. If that is the legislative complement to this bill here, then let's do it. But ultimately, having a healthy and productive workforce and constituency is what we're trying to do in our jobs. And thank you for leading this effort.
All right, so can I get a motion
So
to
moved.
And a second?
Second.
Unanimous. So we pass this forward to the full council with the amendments as assigned. Thank you, everybody. We are adjourned.
Thank you.